Hello and welcome to the Foundation Center's webinar, Foundations and Their Role in Philanthropy. My name is Caroline Herbert. I'm the manager of multimedia training for the Foundation Center and just wanted to tell you a little bit about us before we get started. We are a national nonprofit organization. We've been around since 1956, and our mission is to strengthen the nonprofit sector, the social sector, by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the U.S. and around the world. And this particular presentation, Foundations and Their Role in Philanthropy, is right in line with our mission about advancing knowledge of philanthropy, because we're going to talk about foundation philanthropy, foundation's role in the world of philanthropy in the U.S. We're going to start by talking about exactly what is a private foundation and how are they different from other charitable or philanthropic organizations. Well, look at the foundation's universe. Foundation universe. What does the universe of foundations look like? How many are there? What common characteristics do they share? And what are some of the other types of grant makers? We'll also talk about who gets foundation grants and how foundations operate their grant-making programs. And we'll wrap up by talking about some current trends influencing philanthropy. So let's start with that first question. What is a private foundation? Well, the Foundation Center defines a foundation as a nonprofit organization. So that's a key thing to remember, that they are nonprofits, just like probably your organizations. However, they operate a little differently from other types of nonprofits in that they have an endowment. So let's highlight this word. They have an endowment of their own, which means they are not out there raising money. They are private institutions, private foundations. So their money comes from a single source. They build up an endowment from which they're awarding grants. So that's another big difference, is that foundations advance their mission, as we say, primarily by making grants to other nonprofit organizations. So they derive their funds from an individual, a family, a corporation, and their activities are guided by specific regulations set in the IRS tax code. So here's just a quick little summary of essentially the same definition in bullet points. So just to mention, they're nonprofit, non-governmental, so not public entities, not set up as profit-making businesses. Have their own funds or endowment, usually provided by a family, an individual, a company, or some combination of related parties, like a group of individuals. And foundations' main or only source of income is that endowment or gifts from the donors. Managed by trustees or directors, and the board can include members of the donor's family, corporate executives in the case of a company-sponsored foundation, or independent board members chosen for their expertise. And they're established to award grants. And this means that grants can be awarded for virtually any charitable purpose. So a private foundation often provides very broad-based giving to a wide variety of organizations, or it may have a very specific focus in a particular subject area. And we'll see a couple examples as we go along. And so a little bit more on how foundations are regulated by the IRS in this slide. They have to give away money. So the payout is the fact that they set up an endowed foundation. You can't just sit on the money. You have to be distributing at least 5% of the fair market value of your income-producing assets. Okay, what does that mean? Well, looking at your year-end total of assets, the fair market value of your assets, income-producing, so primarily your stock portfolio. So the fair market value figure, and approximately 5%, you are distributing in grants, and it can also include reasonable expenses incurred in the administration of a foundation's giving program. So of course, as a foundation assets increase, the 5% payout amount will grow over time, so more money is available for grants. What about taxes? I mean, they are tax exempt. They're 501c3 organizations. However, they do pay a special 1 to 2% excise tax on their net investment income generated from their endowments. And if they don't follow that payout requirement and give away enough money, they could be taxed more. They also have to tell everyone what they're doing. Public reporting in the form of the Form 990-PF, which is public information. The Foundation Center and other institutions collect 990 PFs and make them available to the public for free. And that form includes information on the Foundation's finances and operations, as well as a list of all grants. And for many foundations, especially smaller foundations, the 990 PF may be the only source of information on them. And one thing that's confusing about foundations is that the name foundation, the word foundation, doesn't necessarily mean anything legally. I mean, we just went over the official definition of a private foundation. However, there are a lot of different types of institutions that call themselves foundations that technically are not. Over on the right, we have the private foundations category. So things like a university foundation, Indiana University Foundation, they're raising money for that university. They're not really out there making grants. And we have this reference to the filing, the Form 990. These are public charities, so they file the Form 990. They're not private foundations. And then over on the left side, we have all these several examples of real foundations, private foundations, that don't use the word. So just wanted to put that out there, that the word foundation technically is not enough to know for sure what kind of institution it is. So now that we've talked a little bit about what a private foundation is, let's look at the foundation universe. And if we think about how many grant makers are there in the U.S., all different types of grant makers, including private foundations, they're close to 102,000, according to the Foundation Center. But let's go back in time first and talk a little bit about the history of foundations in the United States. Most early foundations were established for the benefit of a particular institution, such as a hospital or an orphanage, or to respond to a specific need, such as educating the poor. Foundation giving as we know it is a little bit more recent. The general purpose foundations with large endowments and broad charters started to emerge at the beginning of the 20th century. The first one to be created was the Russell Sage Foundation, established in 1907, followed by the Carnegie Corporation in 1911, the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. All of those three are still in operation today. Other foundations were established soon afterwards, with a slowdown during and between the two world wars, as you would expect. Then we saw rapid growth of foundations in the 1950s, especially for corporate foundations, which we'll talk about in a minute. Along with this growth came the criticism of foundations over secrecy, unfairly sheltering wealth, and other issues. And this criticism led to the enactment of the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which in large measure still governs foundations and their giving today. And that is what instituted that payout rate and the excise tax, essentially lifting the veil on foundations and saying, we're setting these regulations in place to ensure that this private wealth is indeed used for public good. So the formation of foundations slowed in the 1970s due to both reaction to the new law, tax law, and the poor economy. Then in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, we saw tremendous growth in the formation of private foundations. And in fact, the next slide is looking at some of these stats, going back to 1975 all the way through 2009. In terms of the number of private foundations out there, we saw almost fourfold growth from if we look back to 1975 to 2009. So incredible growth of foundations in terms of the number of foundations, also their assets. I mean, look at these numbers of these are in billions, $30 billion up to almost $600 billion. And total giving $2 billion up to almost $46 billion. So amazing growth in our field of philanthropy. And what's also changed over the years is the location, geographic distribution of foundation assets, and this is 1979 compared to 2009. And the big thing to notice here is the shift from the Northeast to other parts of the country. So traditionally, if you look at the 1975 figures, large concentration in the Northeast, 47%, also the Midwest, South, and especially the West hardly has any back in 1975. And then look at this in 2009, the West is almost equal to the Northeast. South has certainly gained, and the Midwest has lost. In terms of Midwest and Northeast, both lost in terms of their share. Northeast is still the highest, but you can see the shift in wealth to the Southeast. Also the West, and especially, of course, California, growth of foundations in Silicon Valley, and of course Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation being headquartered in Washington State is a big part of that growth for the West as well. The next thing we're going to look at is where foundations fit in the overall picture of nonprofit support. So the title of this webinar is Foundations and Their Role in Philanthropy. We're actually going to look at a bigger picture right now in terms of foundations as a source of overall income for nonprofits. So this comes from the National Center for Charitable Statistics. And this is looking at all nonprofit income, not just private support, not just foundations. So it includes fees for services and goods. So all the organizations out there like private universities, colleges charging tuition, fees for services and goods from private sources. Healthcare institutions primarily are the fees for services and goods from government. So Medicare, Medicaid, reimbursements. Foundations, private foundation giving is here in the private contributions portion at 12.4%. And now we're breaking down the private contributions by source from Giving USA. So this is looking at just the private individuals, corporations, foundations, and foundations are at 14% of the total, $41 billion. And individuals, by far, if you look at how the world of philanthropy is established in the United States, individuals by far are the largest source of support and have been traditionally. But foundations, are there with, usually they've hovered around this, 12 to 15% share of the total. So that's really how foundations fit in the overall role of their role in U.S. philanthropy. So the next thing we're going to talk about is looking at the various sections of the diverse foundation community, what foundations do, how they do it, and thinking about how the foundation community has grown today. I mean, it's really developed because many wealthy Americans want to give back to their communities, are involved in global, traditionally in local issues, global issues. And as we've just learned, the majority of Americans who give to charitable causes give directly, because we saw, individuals are that huge portion of the pie. So why do people choose the foundation route? So let's think a little bit about the reasons for setting up a private foundation, because we can all give to charity. We can all just write checks to our favorite organizations, give directly, be part of that big piece of the pie from that Giving USA chart. But why would we take the extra steps, assuming we had the assets, of setting up a private foundation? Well, the most fundamental motivation for setting up a foundation and all charitable giving, is altruism, the desire to help charitable causes, help make the world a better place. So many donors are motivated by their desire to solve problems, to affect social change. And the foundation vehicle provides the opportunity for a donor to be involved in the giving process and the charitable causes he or she supports beyond the kind of arm's length transaction you might have when you write a check. Donors can gain a greater perspective on nonprofit organizations and their needs in the community by giving through a funding process if they're reviewing proposals, interacting with prospective grantees. They do, there are some tax benefits to set aside money. When you giving money, putting money into a foundation, you're getting a charitable tax deduction for that. And setting aside that money in an endowed foundation, you're essentially setting up a legacy, rather than giving year after year and maybe not being able to give that much in certain years if you don't have a good year in terms of your income. If you're setting money aside in a foundation, once you put it into a foundation, you can't take the money back. So you can have it sit there, grow. I mean, you do have to, as we already talked about, you have to be distributing some money every year. But if you, depending on your investments, you may be able to grow that money and create more of a legacy for your giving. So, and also being able, the idea of being able to balance your giving from year to year, having maybe a more consistent level of contributions. So we're going to continue on with the motivation. So I did already talk about creating that legacy through a charitable endowment. And also, many foundations are a family affair. So wanting to use the foundation mechanism as a way to instill a commitment to giving among generations in the family. And then allowing the donor and the family to create a personal legacy of giving that will exist long after he or she is passed on. So, yes, you can give to an organization and they may even, name a building after you, but having a foundation exist in perpetuity with, essentially continuing your legacy after you're gone. And certainly other reasons can be less altruistic and more self-serving, like wanting to set up a private foundation to gain a higher profile with your giving and in your community. And also it can shield you from direct solicitations if you're going through a foundation that may be managed, may even be big enough to have professional staff to manage your giving. All right, so what do you do if you decide you want to set up a private foundation based on all those motivations? Well, setting up a private foundation, initially you're following all the steps that you would if you're setting up any type of nonprofit. So, establishing your organization under your state's nonprofit incorporation laws, filing for tax-exempt status with the IRS. And this is a very important step because it means that any gifts that the donor puts into his or her foundation are going to be tax deductible. And another part of the formation process is determining the legal and operational characteristics of the foundation, exactly how you're going to operate. So a major decision is if the foundation will be established in perpetuity or have a limited life. Most foundations still are set up to exist in perpetuity. They're not given a termination date. However, we are hearing, this is something we're going to talk about at the end when we talk about trends, we are hearing more and more about foundations setting themselves up with a sunset date, with a plan to spend out the money within a certain period of time. So that's a decision you can make at the beginning when you're setting up or further down the line. Another decision is related to bylaws and your board of directors in terms of how the board of directors will be chosen, what your giving priorities will be, a very important decision, because anything you set forward at the beginning when you set up the foundation are going to ultimately determine what programs the foundation will support, both now and long after the donor is passed on. So once the foundation has received its exempt tax status from the IRS, the donor usually makes a substantial donation to the foundation, which becomes its endowment. And of course, this could be set up through an estate if the donor has already passed on and the foundation is being set up as part of their will. If the donor is still living, they may make a big contribution at the beginning and put money into the foundation over the years. So there are a number of options. But from then on, once they set up the foundation, grants to nonprofit organizations are made from the investment income on that endowment, as long as they meet the minimum criteria of distributing at least 5% of the assets. So next thing we're going to talk about are all the different types of private foundations. And I've already talked about some of these, mentioning company-sponsored foundations, for example. So we already talked about the definition of private foundations. So the IRS has established that definition is, you have a single source of support, you're set up to award grants, but there are several different types within that overall definition. And the biggest category are the independent foundations. There are over 75,000 of these. Company-sponsored foundations, there are about 2,700. Operating foundations, about 8,000 operating foundations. So independent foundations, still the biggest share of the total of all private foundations. So we're going to start with them. And these are the ones, the money comes from an individual, a group of individuals, or family. And independent foundations have boards of directors who make the grant-making decisions. And when the donor or the family remains involved in the giving process, often they're referred to as family foundations. Often the board then is composed of family members. In terms of giving interest, there's really no typical independent foundation. They can give across many fields or can be limited to just one or two. The giving generally does reflect the interests of the donor, no matter how long they've been gone. If they set up the foundation to support, educational activities 100 years ago, they may still be working to support educational programs. The same is true for geographic focus, but there may be a difference between the largest and smallest. So here we have a brief, pretty simplistic chart here, making a lot of generalizations, I will admit, about foundation giving practices, large versus small. So saying the large foundations are more likely to have a national perspective, I think that's true. That the large foundations are more, certainly more able to manage large grants working on a national scale. Also international, they may even have offices in other countries. However, small foundations, yes, they're very likely to give locally, be focused in a local community, but they certainly may also support national organizations. And even the smallest foundation could have international funding interests. With the giving programs, when it comes to the focus of their giving, the larger foundations tend to have program interests that are stated in written guidelines made available to the public, may be limited to a few carefully defined subject areas. And actually, I'm going to go back and forth because we have an example of a large funder's giving statement. This is the Surdna Foundation. I can cut off the top with the name of the foundation, but it's here in the text. Surdna Foundation, you can see their giving statement, seeks to foster just and sustainable communities in the U.S. And then the next slide, they have various program areas like sustainable environments. This is strong local economies. So, very defined giving statements telling grant seekers a lot about what they're looking for, what their interests are. So I'm going to go back a couple slides to go talk about small foundations and their giving programs. We say general giving. Small foundations do tend to have giving interests across many fields, and the interests are more likely to change from year to year, reflecting the donors or the family's interests. And I think it's true that the smaller the foundation, less likely they are to have those very defined program statements like we saw with the Surdna Foundation here again. For example, here's a small foundation, the Louder Foundation. This is all they say. Giving primarily for education, healthcare, and human services. No more detail in terms of what exactly they may fund within those areas. Just going back to this chart to finish up the explanation here. No matter the size of the foundation, the ultimate decision-making does rest with the Board of Trustees. At large foundations, they are much more likely to have staff. Certainly that is very true. That the larger the foundation, the more resources they have, more likely they are to have hired professional staff to manage the grant-making program. However, most foundations do not have staff. Only about 4,000 foundations employ paid staff, And among that group, 60% have only 1 or 2 staff members. Except for the largest foundations, most are administered on a part-time basis by family members, bank trustees, or lawyers. So the very large foundation with dozens of staff people and program officers working on multiple areas, multiple fields, pretty rare. Most are very small family foundations, volunteer run. Well, the next type of private foundation we wanted to talk about is the company-sponsored foundation. And they operate much like independent foundations, except the source of their assets is a for-profit company rather than an individual or a family. Although closely tied to the parent company, company-sponsored foundations are separate legal entities with their own boards of directors, although they're often composed of corporate officers. Currently, we have about 2,700 company-sponsored foundations counted in our database. So they count for about 4% of the private foundation universe, represent about 10% of all foundation giving. The benefits to a company of forming a foundation include tax deductions for gifts to the foundation, and the ability to improve the community in which they're doing business, thus boosting their image and visibility. And setting up a company foundation, it's like the company essentially setting up the legacy of giving, having a consistent level of donations, because they're setting aside money in an endowment. They can't take the money back. It's sitting there and sheltered from the ups and downs, the losses that the company may experience in any given year. The giving interest geographic focus can vary as much among corporate foundations as they do among independent foundations. However, the interests of a company-sponsored foundation are likely to be tied to the interests of the sponsoring company and to the geographic areas where they operate. For example, a drug company might fund research aimed at curing a specific disease related to the drugs it's producing. It may fund the local arts center or after-school program, benefiting its employees and the greater community. Things like that. You often see, we give in areas of company operations, give where we do business. Company-sponsored foundations are different in terms of assets. The source of funds is the corporation rather than an individual, but they're still required to follow the IRS 5% payout rule. They may maintain a small endowment relative to their grant program and fund the bulk of their giving through an annual gift to the foundation. So adding to the assets in good years, allowing the foundation to make grants from its endowment during years in which profits are down. So often they can maintain the level of giving from year to year despite business fluctuations, which is the major benefit to corporations who want to be responsive to ongoing needs in their communities. And here we have an example of just the web page, homepage of a foundation, corporate foundation, MetLife. And they emphasize here their tradition of community involvement. And this is an insurance company, health insurance, so not surprising that they're talking about helping people lead healthy lives, strengthening communities, focus on education, so a healthcare, education, civic affairs, corporate citizenship. So you see a lot of this kind of language used when you're talking about corporate philanthropy. The last type of private foundation is the operating foundation, and there are about 8,000 of these in the U.S. In contrast to independent or company-sponsored foundations, operating foundations use their funds to conduct their own programs or to provide a direct service. About 60% of them also award grants to other nonprofits, although most of these grant programs are small compared to their foundation-administered programs. So examples of foundation-administered programs could include the operation of a museum, a library, a research facility. An operating foundation you may know is the J. Paul Getty Trust, and actually I have a screenshot of their website, the Getty Trust. And they operate a museum. I know it's here down in the small print, but they have a museum, a research institute, a conservation institute, and they do have a foundation from which they award grants, but they're also doing all this other stuff with their endowment. So the operating foundation, typical of an operating foundation, that they're doing a lot more than just awarding grants. And some operating foundations, as we said, don't award grants, outside grants at all. So operating foundations are subject to some of the requirements of the other types of foundations. One way in which they differ is in the payout requirements. To fund their own operations, operating foundations must spend at least the smaller of these two amounts, 85% of their adjusted net income from investments, or 4.25% of their assets. So as you may recall, the independent and company-sponsored foundations have that blanket rule: you must pay out 5% of your assets. But since operating foundations are running their own programs, they can devote much more they devote most of their assets to their own operations. And you may be wondering why they're even in this private foundation category. It's because they do have that single source of support. So the IRS does put them in the private as opposed to the public foundation category. And speaking of IRS and regulations, let's talk about regulations in terms of getting information on foundations. We already talked about the 990-PF as being the mandated disclosure required by the IRS that all private foundations, regardless of their type or their size, must file the 990-PF every year. And for many foundations, this may be the only detailed source of information about them, provides the details on their financial activities, leadership, and for a grant seeker, very interested in the 990-PF because it includes a list of grants awarded for the year. So that is the mandated annual return. Everything else on this slide, having an annual report, having a website, issuing press releases, those three categories are really up to each foundation as to how much they're able to do. So having an annual report, having a website, having written guidelines, primarily the large to mid-sized foundations are the ones that are going to have those detailed guidelines, as we saw for the Certina Foundation. Have a website. I mean, there's no requirement that a foundation has to set up a website. The other sources would be the Foundation Center produces a Foundation Director Online, which is our database collecting foundation information, and we do include all types of grant makers, no matter how small, and we look at all these different sources. Also, periodicals covering philanthropy. A little bit later on, when we look at the Foundation Center's website, I'll show you our key periodical, which is our daily Philanthropy News Digest. Well, I've alluded to other types of grant makers as we've gone along, and besides the private foundations, other types of funders you should know about are grant-making public charities, community foundations, and direct corporate giving programs. Grant-making public charities, we count about 13,000 to 14,000 of these in our database. These are often referred to as public foundations. The most significant difference between private foundations and public is the source of income, that they are raising funds from many sources to support their grant-making activities. Grant-making public charities are a very diverse group of organizations, often focusing on a single population group or issue. An example is the Ms. Foundation, which awards grants to women's groups, the American Heart Association, which funds research on heart disease. Community foundations are actually another type of public charity. We count them separately. So there are just about 900 in our database. They award grants, raise money, and award grants usually within a specific geographic community. Excuse me. So from the outside, they seem to function in the same way as private foundations. But again, what differentiates them is that their assets come from funds set up by multiple donors rather than just that single source of support. Now, what about direct corporate giving? We already talked about corporate foundations, so what's the difference here? Well, although companies, they do set up foundations, but many companies make direct gifts through corporate giving programs. And in addition to monetary support, companies can also provide in-kind, donating products, equipment, or services to nonprofit organizations. So the direct corporate giving programs are not separate legal entities from the parent company, as are company-sponsored foundations. These giving programs may be formal or informal and may be housed in more than one division of a corporation, such as the community relations department. Some companies, large companies, often maintain a foundation and a direct corporate giving program. And information on a company's direct giving may be available, would be available directly from a company through a website or publications. They don't have, this is the only type of grant maker that does not have the mandated public reporting with a 990 or 990 PF. So the Foundation Center, we do collect information on these folks. We have about 1,400 in our database, and we are looking at public sources, getting information directly from the companies. Well, now that we've talked about all the different types of grant makers out there, the next thing we're going to talk about is setting up your grant making process. So how grant makers operate with applications and whether or not they even accept applications. Some foundations could set themselves up to only give to pre-selected organizations. And you'll see that if you're researching funders that, applications not accepted, giving only to pre-selected. And typically you find the ones that don't accept applications are more likely to be the small family foundations that really are just set up to be an extension of the family's philanthropy, not set up to receive unsolicited proposals. However, if a foundation decides they will accept funding requests from nonprofit organizations, they usually, first have to let the public know about their interests and their application guidelines. So they may publish an application guidelines. They may, put it on their website, release an annual report, depending on their resources, send out a press release, or if they're very small, it may just be showing up in their 990 PF. The Foundation Center, we're looking at all of this information to try and get the information for you to say this is the funder's interest. Some funders also release requests for proposals. They have very time-sensitive, specific announcements. We have this pot of money available. We're looking for proposals on a specific purpose. And the Foundation Center collects those as well and puts them into something we call the Request for Proposal, the RFP Bulletin, on our website. Some grant makers prefer a full proposal. Others want a phone call or a letter of inquiry as a first contact. And for a lot more information on this, I would encourage you to look at our training information on proposal writing. So we have other webinars and online courses about proposal writing. So if a foundation requests a letter of inquiry, that's where they want a little bit of information about your project, and if they're interested in learning more, they'll request a full proposal. And when a grant request is submitted to a foundation, the funders will want to know, first of all, the purpose of your organization or the project. Does it match their guidelines in terms of their funding interests? So they'll set up, subject specific, like we saw with the Certina Foundation, MetLife Foundation, this is what we're interested in funding. Often they have geographic limitations as well. So if the proposal makes the cut and fits their guidelines, then you may be notified in writing that they are considering your request. And what you're doing, you're researching foundation interests to figure out, which funders are going to be most in line with what you're doing, and trying to build this kind of grantor-grantee relationship. So, once you find out that the foundation is reviewing, considering your proposal, what happens? And And of course, a lot of this depends on the foundation and how they operate. If they have paid staff, it's the staff's job to, often they're called program officers, to be reviewing the proposals, making recommendations to a board of directors that then makes the final decision. If it's not a staff foundation, then it's board members who are doing everything, reviewing all the proposals, making the final decisions. No matter who's reviewing and making recommendations, they're considering, of course, how closely you fit with their interests and the availability of funds. So looking at, okay, if we have all these projects that fit, what fits the most closely in terms of, okay, if we can only award a certain number of grants, what most closely fits our priorities. Of course, looking at the merits of your project and your organization. They're going to be looking for evidence of your reputation, what kind of results you've seen, what your track record is, how credible you are, looking at your fiscal management, your board of directors, your staff, your budgeting, overall sustainability of your organization. Based on all these factors, they'll decide whether or not to even bring your request to the board for full consideration. So before a board meeting occurs, a docket of recommendations is prepared of, these are all the projects up for review. And usually this docket contains summaries of the recommended proposals. Although occasionally every board member is reviewing the full proposals. And they're presenting, making presentations about each project, answering questions, and making decisions. And once a decision is made, you'll be notified in writing that, hey, we're giving you a grant. Great news. And usually there is a letter of agreement, a contract to sign before you get a check. And during the funding period, the foundation may want a site visit. That could happen before as part of their decision-making process as well. And foundations do also require the submission of at least an end-of-year grant report, if not an interim or quarterly reports. They want to see an evaluation of the program. Did you meet the results? What happened? And for more information on this topic from your perspective as a grantee, check out a couple other training programs, How to Approach a Foundation, and also You Got the Grant, Now What? Are talking about the stewardship process. So we're going to move on to talk more about big picture, what types of organizations get foundation grants. Well, a vast majority are going to 501c3 nonprofit organizations. There are foundations set up to give to individuals, primarily setting up like scholarship programs. So looking at nonprofits, who gets foundation grants? This comes from an annual Foundation Center publication called Foundation Giving Trends. And looking at the dark blue are the dollars, the magenta is the number of grants. So interesting to see, if we're looking just at number of grants, human services organizations are getting the most grants. However, if we're looking at dollar amount, education and health, so that just tells you that, okay, they're getting fewer grants, but it's higher dollar value grants to the education and healthcare. So that's a subject area. The next chart, bar graph, is looking at type of grant. So what is the grant being used for? And we have a whole list of definitions of types of support. We have a glossary of terms on our website you may want to take a look at. But for both categories, number of grants and grant dollars, program, project specific, traditionally have gotten the most support. So this is a funder giving your organization a grant for a specific purpose. Compare that to general operating support in second place, which is giving you unrestricted funding. Which is, yes, we're giving you this grant for your organization. You can use it to pay operating costs, not directed to a specific program. So, very encouraging that that's in second place. I'm still way behind program, but it has been increasing. And by the way, these figures are all from 2009. That's the most recent complete year of data that we're analyzing here in Foundation Giving Trends. And then capital is usually the bricks and mortar funding, funding for building projects, research grant, and student aid. That is primarily, not primarily, all grants to educational institutions setting up endowed scholarship programs. A growing trend is giving internationally. And 2009, so Foundation Giving Trends 2011 data from 2009, we saw 24% of all grant dollars going to international giving. So that is US-based organizations that have international programs and going directly to international NGOs. So huge area of growth every year. Seems like more and more the international grant making has a larger share, and now almost at a quarter of all grant making. So that's one current trend, is more international grant making. What other trends are currently shaping philanthropy? Well, of course, the economy. Here, ever since the economic downturn of 2007, 2008, that has been a continuing theme. And we have seen, we saw 2008 actually saw a record high of foundation giving, because of course the economic downturn, the main effect on foundation assets happened, didn't hit us until 2009. So 2008 saw the record high of $46.8 billion given away by foundations. And you saw the most recent stat we saw in this presentation was $41 billion given away in 2010. So we saw really, so giving, I guess the good news is that giving is really, since that high in 2008, giving has gone down only about 2%. So the good news is, yes, okay, it went down, but not as much as it could have. And between 2009 2010, we saw really flat giving, didn't increase, and we're projecting modest growth in 2011. So yes, the good news is it's not as bad as it could have been. And the continuing globalization, we just talked about that with the continuing, the higher and higher share of global giving from U.S. foundations. And something we've been hearing about for many years is the intergenerational transfer of wealth. The long-term trend of this transfer of assets from older donors, a mature donor base, so what we would call the silent generation, or World War II generation, to baby boomers. And that is happening certainly, and happening now and will go on for years in the future. And $6 trillion transfer of wealth could be allocated for charitable giving. So we may see more and more foundations being established over the years. On the other side, however, we've seen continued government scrutiny of foundations and nonprofits as a whole, looking at our tax-exempt status. So we talked about, in our little history lesson at the beginning of this class, we talked about in the 1950s, foundations being examined for accusations of secrecy and private sheltering private wealth. Those kinds of studies or that kind of scrutiny is still going on, looking at making sure that foundation giving is going for the public good. And new regulations that certainly could affect philanthropy as a whole that could come into effect. It could be the what's happening with the estate tax or inheritance tax. If that is decreased or even eliminated, how it might affect charitable giving, and also the continuing talk of eliminating or scaling back what you're allowed for charitable deductions in an individual's taxes. So all of that, we're waiting to see what will play out and how it may affect philanthropy. So some more specific trends related to philanthropy. Many more types of giving vehicles available besides the traditional private foundation we talked about. For example, the popularity of donor-advised funds, which can be set up at community foundations or commercially related donor-advised funds, which surfaced in the early 1990s. This is where a donor makes a contribution to a fund, like at a community foundation, and then they can specify how and when the money will be used. So the advantage of a donor-advised fund to the donor is that they allow a large donation in a high-income year without the same kind of restrictive tax limitations that private foundations have. So in other words, you're not responsible for a foundation. You're not having to set up a board. You're not doing reporting. You're just making a contribution to something like a community foundation, or the largest commercial donor-advised funds, or the Fidelity charitable gift fund. So it takes some of the administrative hassle out of the hands of the donor. So those are very popular. Also giving circles, where a group of people get together, pool their money to award grants. Very popular among women and women's funds and women's giving circles. Transparency and strategic philanthropy. In a minute, we're going to look at one of the Foundation Center's sponsored websites, Glass Pockets, which is all about foundation transparency. And this is definitely in response to greater scrutiny of politicians. Foundations like, oh, they're looking at us and thinking that we're trying to hide something, so we better be more transparent because we don't have anything to hide and we need to be accountable. Strategic philanthropy is also related to the hands-on philanthropy, where foundations are looking at their own strategies that they have set up their own mission and giving priorities. And this is a trend away from kind of the more passive, oh yes, send us your proposals related to education programs, to yes, we have very specific ideas about what we want to fund related to education. We're going to go out and look for organizations and programs that are going to help us fulfill our mission. So also the more collaboration among foundations in terms of joint funding programs. And the spend down foundations, I talked about this earlier. We were talking about, foundations when they're set up, are they going to be set up in perpetuity or with a termination date? And there is this trend of saying, yeah, we're going to go out of business in 20 years. We're setting ourselves up to spend down. We don't want to be around for forever. We want to have an impact now. And the hands-on philanthropy trend is where foundations are playing more of a role in maybe providing technical assistance to help develop organizational capacity. Also, the venture philanthropy model of providing both dollars and management expertise over a period of years to organizations. And certainly everyone in the nonprofit sector, including foundations, are using social networking more to get their word out. And foundations, this is a very recent trend in the mission investing is something we've been looking at with foundations using their investment assets to achieve mission, not just giving grants away, the 5% that they're required to distribute every year, but looking at their whole endowment and saying, where are we investing our money? Can we be investing our money in ways that are more socially responsible, that are related to our mission? And we actually just did a study on that, and I'm looking at the Foundation Center's website, foundationcenter.org, and you'll notice we have a report focusing here, key facts on mission investing. And this comes from the Gain Knowledge section of the Foundation Center's website, which is one of the main headings across the top. And when you go to Gain Knowledge, you have links to research studies, reports like that mission investing. In this case, we have a headline about foundation leaders addressing state budget crises. All of our research studies are linked here, also our Philanthropy News Digest. So if we go to the National Research Studies Trends, we can get into that foundation giving trends. We were looking at a lot of tables of stats from foundation giving trends. Also, there's foundation growth and giving estimates. Excuse me. This is the Foundations Today series, which comes out every year. We also have, here's Philanthropy News Digest, and it is a daily summary of the big news in foundations and covering trends. So always something to check out. This is also where we have, I mentioned early in the presentation, the RFP, requests for proposals, and we do collect those and put them into this RFP collection online. And this is another website of the Foundation Center, glasspockets.org. And this is our focus on foundation transparency. And there is a lot here. I'm just going to show you a few highlights, including with looking inside foundations. We talked about foundations getting into social media, and we've actually tracked that. Here we have a recent study on foundations using social media. Excuse me, and you can actually go to look at, if we clicked on Explore Now, we look at a whole chart of foundations on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, etc. We also have our Who Has Glass Pockets feature where we actually analyze individual foundations looking at how transparent they are. We also have this section on facts about philanthropy. Where we have a lot of lists, like lists of foundations by assets, learning opportunities like this webinar, our foundation finder to look up some quick information on foundations, and some mapping, metro area funding by foundations, and also this foundation time slider, which is kind of fun, actually looking at foundation growth across the country 1975 to 2008. And then a lot of other statistics, as you can see. On foundations that have websites, we're saying only 29% have websites. And as we were talking about, 76% of foundations have 4 or fewer staff members. So not that many staffed foundations, not that many with websites. And a lot more here to explore. So that's glasspockets.org. Other website, here's another website, is our course materials page where you could go to download. We have a resource list related to foundations and their role in philanthropy, a printout of all these slides, and also links to websites like our National Trends website and the Glass Pockets website. So I want to thank you for tuning in today and encourage you to explore all the other resources at the Foundation Center. Have a great rest of your day.